Hey everybody, this is Juggernaut Fitness TV and this is your host, Jason Blaha. I'm getting a lot of questions from people again, and this seems to be one of the most confusing topics on the internet, and it's something that people don't seem to understand in the modern world that 50 years ago every bodybuilder and strength athlete in the world understood. And that is, what is the difference between strength training and hypertrophy training at the most fundamental level. Now, a lot of people are going to say rep ranges, but the reality is you can get massively stronger on your 1 rep max even doing 10 rep sets, and you can gain massive amounts of hypertrophy even doing singles. So this rep range concept doesn't work. It is almost impossible to get stronger without gaining muscle, and it's almost impossible to gain muscle without getting stronger until specific drugs come into play. But for someone not using any drugs, it's very difficult to separate the two. They tend to go hand in hand to some degree, irrespective of how you train. And when you look at basic rep ranges, older school guys all trained in the 5 to 10 rep range. They very rarely went above 10 reps, and unless they were training specifically to increase their max, they rarely went under 5 reps. But a lot of these guys were still bench pressing 400 and 500 pounds. And this is before the steroid era. So they were still getting very strong doing this, and you will find that a lot of power lifters even train up in the 5 rep range, and sometimes even do 10 or 15 reps. And the real difference has to do with the way that you execute movements, because in effect, you will get more hypertrophy if you increase more metabolic load on a muscle, you increase overall workload, whereas you will get stronger if you are focused on recruiting the most muscle fibers to the weakest point and training your body to recruit muscle fibers and motor units more quickly to the weakest point in any given range of motion. So what that means in layman's terms, you will get bigger faster if you can create a lot of workload and tension on a muscle. For example, on the bench press, if you're just pumping out reps while keeping a focus on the chest to reduce the involvement of some of the other primary movers and keeping continual tension, you will tend to build more hypertrophy in the chest. Whereas then if you want to get a lot stronger on it, you're going to want to do pause work. So I would say the biggest difference to me of strength training versus just hypertrophy training has to do with more or less your rep tempo. If you want to get a lot stronger, you're always going to pause at the bottom, or which is generally going to be the weakest part of the range of motion, pause off your chest and press. Using bench press as an example. But what you will oftentimes find is that even someone who's training for strength will come back through and train a weak link in a body part just like a bodybuilder will, with relatively high reps. They'll work up in the 5 to 10 rep range, and they will sometimes do that constant tension work because it is understood that if they can induce direct hypertrophy in the weakest muscle in a link, they will train that muscle to generate more force. And it is possible to get the best of both worlds. As I've discussed before, if you want a good combination of the two, because again, there will always be overlap, do all your heavy compounds for strength with proper pauses. Don't do very high reps on them, other than maybe on one back off set, and then come back behind and do your more isolation type work, or even certain refinement compounds, such as chest presses with dumbbells. Do those in a tempo, in a manner that's more consistent with what people would consider to be hypertrophy training, particularly if that is a weak muscle group for you in terms of your aesthetics or your overall build. But in short, I consider the difference between training for strength versus hypertrophy the rep tempo and what part of the range of motion you are focused on generating the most speed and force in, and training your weak muscle groups based upon their performance weakness rather than how they balance your aesthetics. And I consider hypertrophy training to be a more bodybuilding type oriented, to where you are putting less focus upon training the weakest range of motion and creating explosiveness and faster motor units through that, and then training your weak points based around aesthetic weak points. So that's the fundamental difference between the two for me. I don't really consider rep ranges to be vastly different for either one. And most people who've been in the game a very long time and have learned their bodies, and even a lot of exercise scientists who study this, will tend to agree with that. All right guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you next time. But let me give you guys a bicep shot before I go.